welcome to those who are joining us now for the book launch of 3 remarkable new books, Touch, Imagination Now, and Radical Hospitality. My name is Sheila Gallagher, and I teach art at Boston College, where it's been my great privilege and a tremendous amount of fun to be a colleague and collaborator with Richard Kearney on the Guestbook project and various other projects. I'm very happy that we are even having this event to acknowledge the recent work of Richard Kearney and Murray Littlejohn and Melissa Fitzpatrick, because it really took some arm twisting to convince Richard that, that it's important more than ever at this time to punctuate and celebrate the good work that is going on in all of our interconnected communities of philosophy and art and social justice. So I'm glad he agreed. I'm going to briefly introduce Richard and Melissa and Brian O'Donovan, and then turn it over to the other 3 who I want to have plenty of airtime, and maybe leave a little bit of time even at the end for questions. Richard Kearney, as most of you know, is a philosopher and public scholar with an incredible intellectual reach and an almost inhuman level of productivity. He's the author and editor of over 40 books. Richard is also a hilarious storyteller, an incredibly inspiring communicator, and a transformational educator. He just won a teaching and mentoring prize at Boston College, much deserved, because really one of his greatest gifts is taking complex and nuanced philosophical thought and making it understandable and relevant to our times. He does not only transmit knowledge, but he gives permission, and he really opens the possibilities for all of us, but especially for his students, to take thought and then to contribute our own unique singularity to the human project of alleviating suffering and to deepening our understanding of what it means to be human in relationship to each other and to the earth. Melissa Fitzpatrick is the co-author with Richard of Radical Hospitality. Melissa is, an intellectual and live wire who's a truly gifted teacher as well. This book I highly recommend. I'll do the plugs since I know they won't plug it for themselves. But it's an incredibly important book which explores how it is and what it is. What is the mechanism by which we move through theoretical or philosophical thought towards really an applied transformation? How do we transform a pedagogy and enact it in the classroom and through real world engagement with the most important challenges of our times, refugees, immigrants, and conflict, violent conflict, and an environment in crisis? This book, the next book that I hope Richard will say a little bit about, because Murray Littlejohn, another one of Richard's PhD students, former PhD students, is not here today. But this is an incredible book that just shows the unbelievable range of Richard and Murray too, really digging deep into imagination. And it's many meetings, aesthetic, ethical, religious, political, in film, in poetry, in literature, and it's an incredible book with a deep range, which highlights a lot of Richard's thought over the last 30 years. Yeah. Finally, do I have it here? I think I have almost all of Richard's books, is his newest book on touch, which has come out, as probably most of you know, to great acclaim, because it is such a relevant topic to this time. What does it mean in this weird age of Zoom and digital, what Richard Kearney calls excarnation? what does that do to us as humans when we start to relate more to each other on keyboards than through hands or touch or proximity, physical proximity? And it's really, as one author called it, it's really a clarion call for us not to lose parts of ourselves as humans living on Earth in bodies, relating to other humans on Earth in bodies. The next person I'd like to introduce, or who I think is going to come on right after me, is Brian O'Donovan. Brian O'Donovan is the best. We all know him as the host of Celtic Sojourn, which is a, has a place of honor in our kitchen radio every weekend. Brian is a long-term contributor to and supporter, board member of the Guestbook Project. Brian is a person like Richard and Murray and Melissa, of incredible generosity, who explores traditional and contemporary music from all around the Celtic world. But one of the great things he does, other people do that, but one of the great things he does is connect emerging artists and to give them an audience and a worldwide platform in which to shine and in which to grow. And so he's also a fellow Corkman, which I hope he's going to talk about shortly. And we have always welcomed his participation in Guestbook because he has been, such a great help to us. And also when we were putting together Twinsome Minds, the performance that Richard and I did to commemorate the 1916 Easter Uprising, and where he helped us out tremendously with the music. So I think it's going to be over to Brian now. Thank you all for coming, and join me in congratulating these three authors on this incredible accomplishment. So thank you.
Hello, and welcome to this wonderful book launch and celebration this afternoon. Though we can't all be gathered in person, isn't it wonderful that we have the technology to do just this? I'm Brian O'Donovan. I work at WGBH, Public Broadcasting in Boston, and my wife Lindsay and I regard Richard and Anne Kearney as amongst our closest friends. Our kids went to Newton North High School together, and we share an interest in, some would say, a passion for West Cork. I'm actually from West Cork, from the little town of Clonakilty. If you go further west and make an effort to get there, because it's a little out of the way, you will come to the wonderful village of Union Hall, and then further on, and even more remote, Squints Harbour, where Richard and Anne have a home. It's an absolute magic place, perhaps one of the more magic places in all of Ireland. Over the years, I have had the great fortune of attending events around Richard's work, and I have been struck by some of the consistent themes he explores. The universal power of stories, for example. A few years back, I was asked to give some music suggestions for a project that he developed with Sheila Gallagher, a project called Twinsome Minds. And I remember being struck at the performance, the staging of that at BU afterwards, one of 18 apparently that were staged around the world, by the sheer adventurousness of it, the creativity, and indeed the emotion it generated in the thousands that attended it. The themes of hospitality and empathy as well, coursing through his work, essentially the concepts that backdrop civilization itself, it seems to me. We are here to talk about three books to be focused on at this launch event. Imagination Now, which is subtitled appropriately Richard Kearney Reader and edited by Murray Littlejohn, who is joining us for this event this afternoon. The book, in turn, is broken into 5 distinct segments: rethinking imagination, reading life, reimagining God, and thinking action, ethics, policy, politics, and peace. And it ends with a wonderfully wide-ranging conversation between Murray Littlejohn and Richard himself. Oh, and look, the cover is actually from a painting by Richard's sister, Sally, who lives in the aforementioned Squints Harbour in West Cork. In the next book, Radical Hospitality, Richard and Melissa Fitzpatrick explore the human stories from some of the world's historic conflicts, exploring themes and challenges of identity and nationality, immigration and borders. Explorations of the themes against such division in our own country today, such entrenched division that I was chilled recently to hear the New York Times referring to it as sectarianism. Sectarianism. That's a word that is very unhappily familiar to all of us who grew up in Ireland in the shadow of the Northern Ireland Troubles. But it takes a radical approach, as they point out, indeed, to make a friend of the enemy, a radical approach that needs to affect all of us. And then there is Richard's most recent work, Touch. Now, is there a more timely topic for an ongoing pandemic? A year of pestilence that has robbed us of the most basic and essential human need, a handshake, a hug, a kiss, a snuggle with a grandchild, holding the hand of a loved one who is sick or dying. It's only in its absence, Richard Kearney said recently in an interview I held with him here at WGBH, it's only in its absence that we can fully appreciate the nourishing, comforting, reassuring, and indeed renewing power of touch. And don't we know it? Now, that this afternoon's celebration is dedicated to our mutual friend, the late Jim O'Mahony, is thoroughly right and fitting, in my opinion. Even though Jim's life professionally was more in the world of politics and banking, he was really a supporter and an appreciator of the arts. His belief in the power of music I experienced firsthand, his love of literature and in the magic of the Irish heritage he was so proud of. The strength of his friendships, and his friendship, of course, with Kearney's particularly, was defining for them and him. Jimmy is so sadly missed and warmly remembered, and his memory is honored at events like this celebration, our gathering here today. It's great to be with you all for this very, very special event. My distinct pleasure to hand you over to Richard himself and Melissa Fitzpatrick.
So thank you, Brian, so much, and thank you, Sheila, for those very, very warm words. Breaking the bottle on the proverbial bow, so to speak. Before I begin to say a few words about the three books and then hand over to Melissa, who will talk more specifically about radical hospitality, I would just like to begin by acknowledging a note of gratitude to our sponsors, the Institute for Liberal Arts here at Boston College, and the Philosophy Department and Fine Art and Studio Art departments. And also a word of thanks to our team here, our guestbook team, Peter Klapes, Jared Hylan, and Angelos Burgas, for managing us and putting this all together. So a word about each of the books briefly. I'll start with Touch. As Brian said in his few words, this was written before the pandemic, and when the pandemic hit, the editor at Columbia University Press, Wendy Lochner, wrote to me and said, Richard, I think you need to add something. So I did. I added a final section on the role of touch in this very difficult time. And the first thing that struck me, the first thing that came to mind was Joni Mitchell's song, You Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone. And it struck me that this was true of touch, that when we were deprived of touch, we suddenly realized what a fundamental sense and sensation it is in our lives. Several people started talking about touch hunger, and there were various research studies done on this theme. People remarking that in the past, for every 100 studies of sight, there was only one on touch. So it was a much neglected sense, even though it's omnipresent in our lives. Our lives begin with touch and they end with touch. The first thing a child does is it reaches out to be touched. And the last thing we do when we're dying is also to reach out to touch and be touched. As so many of us witnessed during the reportage and the newsreels during the pandemic, when patients who were dying were reaching out to touch those, alas, who couldn't be with them, their friends and loved ones and family, but the caretakers. It was one of the most heartrending moments for many of us to watch those scenes. So naked came I into the world, naked shall I depart. As we know from the old adage, life begins and ends with touch, and we're covered by our largest organ, skin, 2 square meters. It seems to me that that makes us very sensitive and sensitive beings. During the pandemic, one thing that came to mind also was the extraordinary role of digital communications. And during that, it struck me that the word digital has this amazing ambivalence, that on the one hand, it means our fingerprint, so it refers to the actual finger, the hand that touches, but it is also the word for our code, for our virtual reality code and communication. So when we touch the touch screen, so to speak, we exit from our embodied incarnate existence, our tactile existence, into a world of virtual interconnectivity. And sometimes the more interconnected we are, the more lonesome we can become. As one philosopher put it, technology overcomes distance, but it doesn't necessarily bring nearness. So this was one of the paradoxes of the pandemic, that we were able to communicate as we are now through Zoom, and yet we were all working from our own individual screens. So a word about the 5 sections of the book, very, very briefly. It opens with sort of a discussion of the colloquial uses of the word touch, as in being touched by somebody or something being touching. To have the touch, you know, as we say of an artist or a musician or a cook or a lover, they have the touch, or touche, where you get it right, you touch the spot that is true. Or when we say, indeed, let's keep in touch at the very moment when we're about to say goodbye. And what I tried to argue for in that opening chapter is for touch as tact, because there can be good and bad touch. There can be enabling touch and disabling touch. We know in the era of Me Too and physical abuse and sexual abuse that not all touch is good. It's not always on the side of the angels. So we need to discriminate and discern between different kinds of touch, which I call tactful and non-tactful. Tact coming, of course, from the same root as touch. And then in the second part, I look briefly at the origins of Western philosophy, where Plato is against touch, grosso modo. I mean, there's 100 Platos, as we know. But when he defines anthropos, he says it's the one who stands up, who gazes upwards. That's what anthropoi means, and looks up at the ideas. Whereas touch brings us back into the animal world, the material world. Now, Aristotle comes along and challenges that in the De Anima, the first work of Western psychology, where he says, no, actually, touch is the most important and fundamental and philosophical of the senses, because it exposes us to what he calls double sensation, that when we touch, we are also touched, a theme that comes up again and again in contemporary philosophy, particularly phenomenology. But this idea that the skin, the tactile skin, is what exposes us to otherness, to difference, to newness, to surprise, and therefore makes us question. So it is the most sensitive, sensible, and philosophical of our senses. And so we get the haptocentric universe, haptic meaning touch, sort of challenging the optocentric universe. Although many would argue that in the West, it was actually Platonism that won out, and that when our age of digital technology came along, and we now live in it fully fledged, the optocentric reigns supreme. So the question becomes then, and this is sort of what I tried to address in the latter part of the book, how do we recover our most vital sense and enable it to cohabit with the digital? Because it's not a question of an either or. It's a question of how do we combine both our tactile and our digital existence. So the third part of the book looks at the wisdom traditions of healing in the West. I was very inspired and assisted by my brother Michael, who's a doctor in palliative care, on the role of Asclepius as one of the patrons of Western medicine, who worked towards a method of healing through a tactile presence, through sort of a synesthesia. Whereas Hippocrates, giving rise to our Hippocratic method, and oath indeed, was much more in the order of the optocentric, of supervision and management of pain, and work towards curing. So we need both, the curing and the healing, but the tactile has a particular role in the Asclepian. Indeed, the very notion of the wounded healer, it's when we are wounded in our bodies that we can, and our psyches, of course, the two being one, that we can in turn heal others. And then that led into a discussion of trauma and contemporary trauma theories and studies and practices, where the body keeps the score. As one very important book by Leonard Koch puts it, the body keeps the score. And then I conclude with a discussion of touch in our digital age, arguing for a sort of a cohabitation or a collaboration between a commons of the body on the one hand and the World Wide Web on the other. So before I leave touch, I'd just like to thank in particular Wendy Lochner, who's been a terrific editor, and the team, the Columbia University Press team, from Joanne Raymond to Lowell Fry to Susan Pensack, Bradenton Kostica, the series editor, who became like a family over the last year or so in the production of this book. You know, the thousands of emails and Zooms and whatnot. And even though I only know Wendy in person, I feel I know the others by proxy, thanks to digital communications. So moving on very briefly to Imagination Now, the reader that Sheila and Brian have both mentioned. I've been astonished by the extraordinary energy and enthusiasm and expertise and indeed patient devotion of Murray Littlejohn, who how shall I put it, read through dozens of books and articles and essays and chapters to come up with the 20 selections in the reader itself. And to conclude with a conversation which was a real joy to experience. So thank you, Murray Littlejohn, who is listening in from Paris. He did ask me, by the way, to thank on his behalf the editorial team at Rowman and Littlefield, the publishers Frankie Mace, Rebecca and Astasi, and Scarlett Furness. So finally, Radical Hospitality, dedicated to a great friend, James Mahoney, who passed away last summer, a great human being, and a great inspiration for Guestbook. How many walks we had in the nearby Cold Springs forest, where we discussed so many, germinal and germinating ideas for Guestbook, and on cross-country skis in Lincoln that seemed to go on for hours. Just precious moments, and Jimmy will be greatly, greatly missed, as we say in West Cork and Kerry, Ní beg a lehéad a ríseán, his likes will never be seen again. So we're very happy to dedicate the book Radical Hospitality to Jimmy's memory. I'm going to pass over now to Melissa, who will talk about more about Radical Hospitality. Suffice it to say that it serves for us both as co-authors as sort of a manifesto, a philosophical manifesto for Guestbook, applying the theory of hospitality and the project of turning hostility into hospitality, given the fact that both terms come from the same root, hostis, which can mean enemy or friend. That particular project we try to apply to a number of different examples. In my part of the book, take examples of linguistic and narrative hospitality, the exchange of memories and stories as they operate in the Twins of Minds project, which I conducted with Sheila Gallagher, and then the experiments also with Guestbook story bites and documentaries that we visited and discussed earlier today in our Guestbook Symposium, and then culminating with carnal hospitality, the importance of the handshake. So the double hospitality of word, narrative on the one hand, and of touch, the handshake on the other. So now it gives me great pleasure, thanking you all for being here, by the way, to pass on to Melissa Fitzpatrick. Melissa.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for being here. It's so good to see faces that I don't see anymore. I said this in the symposium earlier, even if it's on a screen, things have been so different. So thank you, Richard. Radical Hospitality, this was a really fun project. Richard and I, like he said, wanted to create a short, accessible guest book manual, a little book, as Richard put it when we were putting it together, on the philosophy behind guest books. So the philosophy of hospitality, exploring the notion of hospitality head on, and as the title suggests, from theory to practice. So we're so grateful to Jack Caputo and Tom Lay for the opportunity. They helped us put it together so quickly. In the first 3 chapters of my part, I go through some of the key figures who wrestle with hospitality, either directly or indirectly. So Kant, Levinas, Arendt, among others. And the last chapter, Hospitality in the Classroom, most near and dear to my heart, was inspired by hands-on work with the Philosophy for Kids program. So teaching Introduction to Philosophy to high school students in the Mississippi Delta and on the Mexican-American border in El Paso, Texas. So right on the Mexican-American border. So Philosophy for Kids, for those of you who don't know, is all about bringing philosophical inquiry to K through 12 spaces and actually flipping the classroom. This is something we hear even more in the Zoom reality. So fostering discussions that may not have a clear aim, letting young people ask whatever questions come to mind, and letting young people guide, like seriously guide, taking the reins from the teacher, real honest conversations with each other in a safe place. So the main objective is building a community of inquiry grounded in listening. So as Anandi said earlier in the symposium right before this, listening to listen for its own sake, not to think about what you're going to say next or to one up the other, but actually just to stop and listen. So pedagogically speaking, this type of pedagogy is such a natural pair with Guestbook. What I quickly learned doing Philosophy for Kids is that hosting strange ideas and the perspectives of others in the classroom leads to a more open, hospitable disposition there and also beyond the classroom. So the classroom is, I think, the chief place in which we can, to borrow Hannah Arendt's phrase, renew the common world. So this is from her essay on the crisis in education. So a diverse world that is ours, a world grounded in hospitality to both others and the unknown, not just other people, but new ideas, things we haven't thought before. So an important dimension of renewing the common world is co-constructing new knowledge by giving credence to fleshing out and exploring new ideas. So what's other than our own ideas, or what's comfortable, what we already know. So this involves not being afraid of conflict in the classroom, which I know can be tough. It takes courage, and where better to form and foster courage as a virtue than in the classroom. So students living in the border in El Paso, literally living within 2 worlds, are hungry for this kind of courageous work as they quickly shift from insider to outsider in actually the blink of an eye. Many of them cross the border every morning to go to school, and things change so radically just in the span of half a mile. The students in the Deep South are also hungry for this kind of work. They're still plagued by deep racial division in a part of the country that has not changed in decades. It was eye-opening, a true shock to be there. So the diverse group of kids I worked with there in the Delta were so ready and willing to earnestly and openly work through racial presuppositions, ask me all kinds of questions, and really challenge each other and myself to think differently in the safe community of inquiry that we formed together. So even though the exchange there, we're talking earlier about digital exchange, even though the exchange there wasn't digital, it was authentic exchange, or what Joe called story work. I love that, where people just sort of like give their anecdotes, give their perspectives, and people listen to what they have to say. So the final thing that I'll say is that the great thing about peace pedagogy is that it's something that can happen anywhere and anytime, any place where a conversation can happen. And with young people, the time is truly always ripe. And Guestbook stands behind this. So, young people really embrace it. They are more malleable in their thinking. They aren't married into any particular point of view. This is the beautiful part about philosophy for kids. You just see the way that they are so ready and willing to step out of their comfort zone and entertain new ideas in the way you just don't see with adults, right? They're so ready to host something and be surprised. So young people are so brave in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and close things now. So we want to thank all of you guys so much for being here and for your patience and attention. I know we're all zoomed out. There's like 10 conferences happening at the same time. So a lot of you guys have been staring at the screens all day. I've seen people in other places, but it was really wonderful getting together to celebrate these books. And in the spirit of touch, let's all keep in touch. Hopefully next time we can be together and actually raise a glass to celebrate. That would be great. I think it'll be the case. So it was so nice to be here with Sheila and Brian. I also want to thank Peter, so the executive manager at Guestbook, and Angelos and Jared, also part of the Guestbook team. They're the stars behind the scenes making everything happen. So enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone. Go outside if you're in the Northeast, it's warm. Thank you.